Let's call this meeting of the Ethics and Election Committee to order. It's a couple minutes after noon, and today is September 28th, 2022. Let's do introductions of assembly members. I'm the chair, Pete Peterson, and to my left,
Christopher Constant.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Red.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Suzanne LaFrance, okay, and members of the elections team.
Jamie Hines, Election Administrator.
Barbara Jones, Municipal Clerk.
Dee Ennis, Observer Liaison.
Dean Gates, City Council.
All right, and in the audience today we have former Assembly Member John Weddleton. Good to see him here.
Mr. Peterson, I think we have people on the phone.
Oh, okay. Who
And
is on
Mr.
the
Chair,
phone?
yeah, thank you.
Is that Austin?
Yeah, hi, Austin Quinn Davidson. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else on the phone? All right, well, fantastic. Jamie Allard has another meeting until 1 and will not be joining us today. All right, let's get right into new business, and we've got Title 28 amendments. And Ms. Jones or Ms. Hines, which one of you is going to lead us through this?
That would be me.
Oh, great, you drew the long straw, I guess.
Yep.
Okay, proceed, thank you.
All right, if you guys want to look at your ordinance, I am going to go over the AM and sort of explain the AM as you guys look at the ordinance to help you out here. It's a very short ordinance with some minor code changes. The first section is, in section 1, is AMC 2810-040 definitions, and this is where we clarify between signature and mark. The definitions clarify, or as you can see in the first, in signature, the definition of signature is clarified and is no longer circular. We've also included the verified signature so that you can see every signature from this previous definition is verified. And then we're also going to be defining mark, which isn't in the definitions because it's used in code in many contexts. And we are adding in the necessary sections of code, which you'll see in sections, or on page 305, section 305. Yeah, section 5, which is on page 305. In the next section, which is on page 205, it's AMC 2820-015, the time for passage of ballot propositions. The time frames for passage of ballot propositions was set up at a time when the MOA was required to obtain Department of Justice pre-clearance under the Voters' Rights Act, and those requirements no longer apply, and so we are able to extend the deadline to allow time for a veto and a veto override. So that is section 2.
Question.
Mr. Gates, did you have a
I just
question?
wanted to add that part in this meeting, with the time for reconsideration. I just wanted to add comment, we should also add that this time as for vote on reconsideration also, because
I might speak briefly.
Ms. Jones?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Gates, if you could please propose an amendment to this section regarding reconsideration, that would be appreciated. We couldn't have until reconsideration is obviously due at the meeting or within 24 hours. So if you could help us explain when that reconsideration has to happen under this, because I wouldn't mean it to mean that it happen at 60 days. It's not giving an extension for a motion to reconsideration, nor an extension for the assembly to take action on that reconsideration. So if you could help us clarify that, that would be helpful.
I'm sure I'll send something that we.
So Mr. Gates is going to put an amendment together for us to clarify reconsideration, and we can look at that when this is before the Assembly for passage. Is that the plan?
This is a draft, so he'll submit it to us and we'll.
Oh, that's right, this is a draft. Okay, good, perfect. Did you have
Yeah, I
something to
just
say,
was going
Mr.
to
Costa?
say thank you that Mr. Gates sent us an email that had some language in there for a preview on this. And I appreciate Barbara's nuance to the question.
Okay, moving on to section 3. This is AMC 285220, video viewing of election processes at designated return location. We are providing more clearly here, we are defining the beginning of the election processes for the purposes of live streaming. It sets the standard, and the standard is best efforts, and it reiterates that there is no cause of action for video recording.
Right, and it's, it's difficult to predict when you're going to have technical problems. And sometimes they're fixable immediately, and many times you can't figure out what's wrong for a while. So, I think that's a good clause to add in there. Thanks.
Thank you. Section 4, which I think is, for most parts, is on page 3 of 5, is a simple typo correction. Section 5, again on page 3 of 5, is AMC 2870030 ballot return envelope review standards regular. And this change allows the election commission to meet only once instead of twice. As a practical matter, no military uniformed and overseas absentee vote ballots were received between the public session of canvass and certification in the 2022 elections. And here is where we introduce the definition of mark and expanding. Can't read my tiny little writing there.
Well, and so, what about, say, in the election of 2021, do we remember when the last one of the overseas military ballots might have arrived?
It's my understanding that this was implemented in December of 2021, so it was after the 2022 elections are the only 2 elections where they were doing a public session of canvass and then trying to have the public session of canvass meet a second time.
But we did have military and overseas voters before. I just happened to think of that question. You probably don't have that information right off the top of your head.
We can find that information.
Okay, thank you. Proceed.
Right.
Ms. Jones?
Through the chair, the numbers are very, very small. If there were any, it may have been 1. The reason this is important is that the clerk's office, first of all, you remember that the public session of canvass, the code says it can be up to the 3rd Friday after the election. And it was always traditionally the 2nd Friday. And then you certified on that middle Tuesday. So this year we extended the public session of canvass. Remember, we wanted to do it on the 3rd Friday. So basically, you're giving those military and overseas voters extra time already. But what happens as a practical matter is that the clerk's office scheduled the public session of canvass let's say on that third Friday. But this rule allows military and overseas voters to get their ballots in on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday at noon. And then we have to reconvene the election commission. And you understand that what that means is everything that comes in the mail, we process it, and we're processing up until noon, running to the post office, processing, opening, running until noon for, what this year was nothing, and I think last year it was also something very small. But it's complicated for the election commission to have to meet again if we have to reject one of those envelopes because of, no signature or no signature match. And we're just trying to simplify the process. We want every vote to count, but we're giving voters a lot more time. And this time, it's not a significant cut because you've extended it a week, and now we're just taking away a couple of days, which would be taking away from that week. Sorry, that's kind of complicated.
Ms. France?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I recall too, this year on the assembly, we ended up certifying at a regular meeting. And I'm just thinking of the calendar, and it may not be anything that this ordinance impacts, but is the timing such where we will be able to avoid having to certify at a regular meeting and can do it at a special meeting? I don't have the calendar in front, and I know we approve the assembly calendar for the year.
Through the chair, Ms. LaFrance, we are asking the assembly to make this a practice. And there are a couple of reasons for it. We think that the elections team needs the extra time to process the election. We need that extra week to process the election. And I think there are a lot of ballots and a lot of steps that need to be done, and we just think it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing for our voters because it gives our voters all of those 13 days to cure, I believe, is what it is. So even if they voted on election day, if they made a mistake, they have 13 days then to fix that. So I realize that it is complicated for the assembly, and we could discuss some options for that. You could hold a special meeting at 4 o'clock to certify if you wanted to. I believe that the code says that it's as soon as practicable. I'm not sure if it's as soon as practicable or at the next regular or special meeting, but it's something like that. So if the commission holds the public session of canvass on Friday, and so if you just think about the calendar, your meeting is on, let's say, election day is the first Tuesday, and your meeting is the second Tuesday, and then the third Tuesday is now going to be open instead of certifying in 2 weeks. And so it would always be that third week, and you'd have to have a meeting then, unless you wanted to do back-to-backs, which I don't think you do for other reasons. So we can talk more about that, but we're going to recommend that you would certify after the public session of canvass on that Friday. If you wanted to, I don't think we could do it on Monday. I think that would be really difficult for the election team. We're barely finishing on that Tuesday. We're having 77 to 90,000 voters, and we're really trying trying to make sure that our reports and everything that you get is accurate. So again, I think this might be something we can talk more about if it's inconvenient for the body and we could pick other options.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. And I am in support of however much time is needed. I guess I'm just thinking of the fact that many of you who support the elections also support the assembly in those regular meetings. And it just seems like a lot of work. And I know coordinating the swearing in, and there was someone who was sworn in remotely too. And so I guess I'm just saying I support, if we have to take a bigger look just to make sure that there's definitely enough time, and you're not having to juggle. I mean, I know you're always going to be juggling many things. That is the nature of the clerk and the elections. But anyway, yeah, I would love to have those further conversations. Just a quick question too, just on the definitions. When you say ballot is received, you go to the post office to get those, or are they received here? Just if you wouldn't mind refreshing my memory.
Are you referring in 2870-030 received, or?
Yes.
In those cases, we go to the post office. Yes, we send a team of 2 to the post office to pick up everything after election day. A team of 2 goes to the post office to pick them up.
Okay, thank you. And then going back to 28.50.220, on when you first referred to the election beginning with the delivery of unmarked ballot stock, is that here then? They're delivered here?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
It's the video viewing of election processes at designated return location, and I think that we've defined designated return location as
Got it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. And proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Section 6 starts on page 4 of 5. This change this change codifies a common challenge to adjudication, which was granted by the Election Commission. It was an interpretation of some challenges regarding X's or slashes across more than one bubble fill-in, and we intend to create a guide which will come forth in 2023. However, we wanted to get this into code now to address it sooner.
Okay, I don't see any questions. Proceed.
Oh, that's all the code changes. The next section is section 7, and it says this ordinance shall be effective immediately.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Constant?
Thank you, sir. So this is a pretty slim ordinance this year. Nominal changes relative to some years past. And it seems early as well. Like in years past, we've kind of gotten more close to late October, I think, maybe early November or later. And so the question I have is there anything in percolation that might be coming as a kind of part B of this, or is this the whole suite that we're thinking we're going to see before the end of the year, and then unless something unanticipated happens, the beginning of the next contest?
As far as code changes go, this is all we anticipate. We were also proposing some minor amendments to the election observer handbook, which is in AR, which is next item on the agenda. So these two we anticipate traveling together, but once these are done, that's all we anticipate for this year.
Okay, thank you. Early and slim. I like it.
Well, fantastic. I don't see anyone else in the queue right now. So I guess we could move to the Observer's Handbook amendments.
Okay, let me find my AM. So our observer registration process is simplified. Election administrator or designee is going to sign the badges instead of having the campaign or the candidate or campaign manager sign the badges, which is an extra step at a busy time. That change, I'm sorry, I don't see the page numbers on that. I believe that is on page 8 of 32. Then, beginning on page, well, the crux of it is on page 16. Observer challenges concerning voter eligibility, ballot not properly cast or ballot improperly rejected, and signature verification and adjudicative of vote. The observer complaint and suggestion process has been expanded. Election worker conduct will be filed with complaints, and these are need to be referred to HR or further investigation. Administrative concerns can be submitted on informally as conversations during meetings or submitted on suggestion forms. And if suggestions or concerns are not resolved in a way that the outcome, in a way that the observer or the candidate is satisfied with, a new form will be created, which is failure to comply with law or illegal election practices, and that form will be renewed to the clerk or election administrator to be taken forth to the election commission to review. And that is all we have for the observing events.
So you're in the process of creating that new form?
I do need to create that new form, so yes.
Okay. Dee?
Just wanted to emphasize that under the new form, it's an unresolved suggestion or concern that would affect the outcome of the election. And that's carried through the illegality, all that kind of things, because the election commission doesn't have time to deal with suggestions such as signage. That's not their purview, but they must, of course, be concerned with anything that would affect the outcome of the election. So only those suggestions and concerns that are not resolved that could affect that come before the commission. That gives the commission time to look at these important issues. And in that form, it will require explanation of all events creating the concern, citation to applicable code, and explanation of how the matter raised would change the outcome of the election. So it's not 30 suggestions as to signage or staffing. It's the real crux of issues that observers bring forward.
So what you're saying, it has to be significant enough that it will affect the outcome of the ballot?
Yes, which is required and is part of the election commission's duties.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. Any questions from members of the committee? Mr. Constant?
A slight nuance to that, it's that if found to be true, it would change the election's outcome. So just a slight nuance.
Right, it would have to be verified. All right, and so that's the major changes in the Observer's Handbook?
Those are, yes, Mr. Chair, those are the changes to the observer handbook.
Well, and there's not a long list this year because we went completely through it last year and updated it, so it makes sense that there's not many changes this year.
Yeah.
Any questions from members of the committee? Not seeing any. I guess we can move on to the next item on our agenda, and that's the review of AO 2022-77.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Cross, I was under the impression was going to be here to present that. I have the ordinance and the graphic here. If Mr. Gates was able to present, but I am not aware of how to present this without Mr. Cross here.
Well, Ms. Hines, maybe Mr. Weddleton is here because he wants to make that presentation on this, because I think he might have had a hand in doing that. And so, would you like to join us at the table and turn on a microphone, Mr. Weddleton?
I'll be here.
Right over, right over there.
May I be excused?
Yes, Dean.
My work is done.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Cross.
Oh, we've been joined by Mr. Cross, and the timing is perfect. We've made it down far enough on our agenda that your item just came up, Mr. Cross, so.
Perfect timing. I appreciate that. My apologies for being late. Appreciate everybody being here. Is this the smallest room we could find?
Yeah, it's nice cozy group too.
All right. Shall we dig in, John? Excellent. So,
Proceed.
2022-77.
Mr. Cross, you can use the button here.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I was hoping that the pure volume and robustness of my voice would compensate, but this microphone went on.
Not in this large room.
All right, so I want to give most of the credit here to John Weddleton. Of course, as you know, this previously was an ordinance that was mostly worked on by he and Mrs. Kennedy. And then I was fortunate enough to pick up the ball and help to keep it rolling. You know, if you've had a chance to take a look at the ordinance, what we're looking to do here is a couple simple things. One is give clarity to the process of which filling a vacancy and how those timelines should occur. We've instinctively realized that if you don't have a graph, you don't look at it, just look at these dates, it can become a little convoluted. And so one of the things we've done is kind of fill out a graph to see how these things are going to work. And give clarity not just to ourselves, but to the voters, which is critical, so that they understand the process. Two is that we understand that anybody that's the acting mayor or acting assembly individual, that an individual who's appointed and not elected should be in there for the shortest amount reasonable, okay? And so we have to balance the amount of time that they're in there against the expense of a special election. And at some point, special elections are not, well, at no point are they cheap. But we have to then determine and agree on what would those dates look like. That when an individual is appointed to a position, what is a reasonable amount of time that we would then say they either continue that term or we have a special election to fill it. But even a special election then creates other issues, doesn't it? Because if you have a special election that happens too close to a general election, then we have two elections on top of each other, creating even more expense. And so what John, Crystal, and ourselves have been working on is trying to figure out what are clear expectations and what is reasonable in the multiple circumstances during the 3-year term of either assembly person or a mayor of filling those vacancies. Okay? And so the best I can provide here is that when you read through this, unless you write it down on like a graph like we've provided here, I don't know about you, but I just have trouble wrapping my head around it without a visual. John, did you want to add anything to what I've laid out?
No, thanks. That was good.
Go ahead, Mr. Weddleton.
John Weddleton. I think everyone here except Mr. Cross has suffered the burden of confusion over the way the charter is worded. They did not always do us a favor when they wrote the charter, and we know the phrase not less
Mr.
than
Chair.
90 days.
I'm sorry, Mr. Whittleton, can you get closer to the mic? I can't hear you on the phone.
Oh,
Thank you.
Is this better? Can you hear me now, Austin?
A little bit. It's generally hard to hear, but you're the hardest to hear. So, yeah, I'll just do my best. Thank you.
I'll try. So I was recounting our pain when we had the special election a couple of years ago, which carried the most burden of Austin. Back with the phrase not less than 90 days, of course, it was confused. Some people thought sooner than 90 days, and some people thought after 90 days. It's just puzzling, but you know, the charter should be clear to people. And then the phrase regular or special election, of course, that was very convoluted. Which will it be, or both? So the charter should have confused people. So a real major goal here is just to spell out very clearly what will happen and when. So no later assemblies have to deal with that kind of confusion. And then having started with that, it is, as Kevin said, the default is to have an unelected mayor for as short a time as possible, and to avoid the overlap of the regular and the special election as much as possible. And that's that 270 days seem to work. Keep it separate. This graphic really does help. One issue on this, and I hope you put this on the ballot. If you do, this graphic will help explain it. One is that in the order in the ordinance, this last line here is actually 1A, and the one above it is 1B. It doesn't follow the order that's in the ordinance. The ordinance first addresses the if it occurs less than 150 days, and then that's this. So I don't know if the graphic should be changed, or if within the ordinance it would be changed to match the graphic. Just so we're just thinking forward, educating voters on this. We'll make this clear as possible.
Okay, thank you. So looking at the between 150 and 270 days, so if we have a special election, so that the mayor finishes the rest of the remaining term of the mayor who resigned, and then gets the entire 3-year term, or exactly, is that the plan?
That is correct. And so, simply because if you're having the special election would take the place of the general election, just because that time frame, it wouldn't make sense to have a special election and then 60 or 90 days later have a general election. That expense, at some point, we have to recognize that the expense of that outweighs the benefit. Yeah?
Mr. Wilton?
Having a mayor in for a very short time could be a very profound impact. And I was actually met a fellow who's the longest serving Caucasian in the Bristol Bay Borough. He's got a job up there. He was fired for 5 days because they had a person in the mayor's seat. Mayor was gone. He filled in, and he fired 5 people. And the new mayor came back in and rehired them. So little impact except it wrecked his whole mayor's time. But we should think about that. And wherever you do this, a short-term mayor could really make some dangerous changes. So this not only simplifies things, but it limits the ability for someone to come in with a sledgehammer.
Right. Plus, there's always a transition when you bring in a new mayor, create a whole new administration, and so I can see where there could be extremely confusing.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, and that was the point I was also going to make, is that we understand that in order for someone to take up the role of heading the administration and operations and budget, that there is an acquisition period that is strenuous. And so you basically that individual, if it was for a short period of time, probably spends most of it just trying to comprehend all the balls that are in the air, being less effective. And then here we go, and then we've got another person repeating that process rapidly.
Well, fantastic. And I think Mr. Gates had a hand in putting this together. Mr. Gates, do you have any comments about this?
Well, I would just say I think that Mr. Cross and Mr. Weddington described this beautifully, and the goals of this ballot proposition change. And I would just add one more point about how this shortens, I guess, the time period for an acting mayor or to be in office before a new mayor was elected. And that's when the newly elected mayor takes office. Right now in our code it says July 1st after the regular mayoral election, but that's like from April to July 1st. It's like 2.5 months or so, or maybe 2 months after certification. But what we've done here is say that if it's a special election for a mayor, that new mayor takes office 30 days. So it's a little bit shorter than the regular transitional period at regular mayoral election. So that also condenses the time period where you have a temporary mayor in place.
Yeah, I always wondered a little bit why there was such a lag time before a new mayor was sworn in. And I'm not sure why that was done that way, but things were not done electronically and digitally back when the charter was drawn up, and so things may move a little quicker nowadays, I guess. Mrs. LaFrance, did you have a question or statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Kevin and John, for addressing the issue of the confusion about the dates. And yes, I remember that very vividly, John, when people read that to me. We need to take action now. We only have this many days. And I guess the challenge that I'm having, and I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to this a little more, is with the third line where there isn't a regular election for the mayor. And I'm not sure why, but that really bothers me, that we would not have a regular election. And so I was wondering if maybe you both would be willing to speak a little more to why that's okay, or why the benefits of, and I heard you say, Kevin, Mr. Cross, a savings money-wise, and that's true. But again, just the fact that the regular election is part of our institution of local elections.
John, you go first, and then I'll give my thoughts. Thank you.
Part of it, you could. Well, one is the expense. The other is you could have a mayor in such a short amount of time, and it could be a different person. You have 2 different elections. You have a different person in there, so that could create confusion. And if it's the same person, it just streamlines things. You just have one. It would seem a little odd. Certainly it's out of our habit, but this is the whole thing with the mayor resigning. It was out of our habit. It just, if you think of the alternative where you have someone in and over 2 months, and during that time they're running for this regular election, and they may not win, can they really take any action? They can do anything for those 3 months or 2 months, or whatever. Just puts them in a limbo. We really don't quite have a mayor. It'd just be very odd. And so it's unusual not to do the regular election, but to do it, then where do you put this mayor?
Yeah, follow up on that. I think we all would agree that this should be exceedingly rare. This situation is not something that we should be dealing with even once a decade. Okay, this should be exceedingly rare that we would have to dig into this kind of process. Okay, and that we pray that for whatever reason now, whether it's maybe it's just natural, a natural disaster or something, that we end up with the unfortunate situation that we have a vacancy. So one is this is exceedingly rare. 2 is when we talk about this short period where you wouldn't have a general, that's scenario 3. Really got to think about the complexity. If you were to have a special election, not just so that you can make sure you have your general election in less than 9 months, so 270 days, 9 months. But then you have that special election, you have that transition period, then you have a general, and currently as it's set up, that particularly in assembly, that individual who's in that special election, especially if they may not run in the general. and maybe prohibited from doing so. And so we're going to have in a very short order a transition of leadership in the administrative role. And at some point, do we acknowledge that that would be handicapping and that would significantly limit that branch of our government and being effective? And that has to do with appointments and filling vacancies. And I mean, it's not just the vacancy they have, but there may be seats underneath that temporary mayor under the special election that have to be filled. And then you have another mayor come in and they have another people. And so there's a potential during that period of a special elected mayor to a newly elected mayor that could be, for lack of a better term, chaos. So how do we limit that so that government can continue to run for the best for the best purposes of serving the individual? And so understanding that, I guess my thought on that is every time we have a switch, there in that transition period isn't always smooth. There's always issues. Some of them are mostly inconveniences, maybe the problems, but how do we limit that so we're still effective?
Thank you, Mr. Cross. Mr. Cossett has a question.
I'm not sure it's a question. It's more a concern, same line. I have a broader concern with the approach of making a charter amendment instead of a code, because the code is easier to move in case certain circumstances over time. But the sweetener of moving the expenses outside of the cap for these special elections that just seem to happen so often is an idea to me that is interesting, and so it's kind of, I'm pulled in two directions on this one. But the concern that comes up to me for this line here, and I hate to put politics on this, but I'm going to, is that I could imagine a scenario where a candidate's been working hard to run for mayor and has 1,000 supporters who donated, $100 each. And then you have someone who has a wealthy friend who could write a $100,000 check that could come in at the last minute. The person who's been raising that money over time can't spend that money on this special election because it came out of nowhere, right? And APOC you can't just move your money over to a new campaign. But then in some ways it benefits those who have rich benefactors who might be able to invest in such a way that they become almost unstoppable because of money, and then unstoppable for the next 3+ years, right? Whatever that 6 or 9 month period is. And so I guess it wouldn't be that long, but 4 to 5 months. And so I have some concern about the idea of canceling a special election that's been ongoing, canceling a regular election that's effectively been ongoing for whatever that time period is minus 18 months, or 18 months minus that time period. Because that's when a candidate has the legal right to commit to the race. And so we saw that in this last election, that and it wasn't a concern that was ever brought to the table, it wasn't a factor, but that it could have wiped out any effort that the individual A had made and predisposed a benefit to individual B. So I'm not sure what the answer is there, but it's a question that I'm chewing on in my head.
Ms. Hines?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to note that I don't think that it would cancel a regular election. We still have school board members and clerks of board members to elect and propositions to act on. It just would be that in the third scenario, it's my understanding that there would not be a mayor's race on that ballot.
The mayor's race would be
Each
on
race
the-
is a contest, and it would cancel that contest.
Yes.
And so it would cancel that election, and so we could hone in as tightly or out as we want, but effectively, that would cancel a mayoral election based on a scenario that created a vacancy, which is, to me, that's similar to Ms. LaFrance's concern. It's an institution, it's a process that has almost a year, it has a year and a half possibly in more, depending on how much time somebody spent getting an order. So that's a scenario I can't quite square.
Mr. Cross?
No, you make a really good point. I guess my question is, what would need to change? And forgive me, because several of minds here are more educated on this than I am. In scenario 3, what are the provisions by which the special election for the mayor is just the general election taking place on a different date? I guess, is that a code? Is that a charter issue? I mean, how do we, if you call it, don't call it a special election, call it a general election that takes, just for the mayor, that takes place sooner, what does that look like? So that those individuals who have been accumulating money or saving can utilize those funds towards that election. And I don't know either, but I guess that's my thought on how you resolve that, is it just becomes general election phase 1, and then general election phase 2 when we do the school board and everybody else.
Mr. Gates?
Bring the attorneys.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to add, when we see in researching this charter provision in some of the charter commission transcripts in the past, maybe about a year ago or so, one reason that the original charter had the election not taking place less than 90 days after vacancy occurs was to give time for candidates to ramp up their campaigns, get staff, and put out their message and so forth. And I think that that point is just sort of relevant to the time periods we're talking about here for election campaigns. That was the reason they said don't have a mayoral election to fill vacancy less than 90 days after vacancy. You need time for the leader of our city, or the future leader of our city, to ramp up, get ready, and so forth.
Right, and you know, if you had an election sooner than 90 days, say a sitting assembly member who had been on the body for a number of years that had really good name recognition could jump in there, and if you had an election 45 or 60 days, they would have a big advantage because the first-time candidates would have less of a chance to get their names out there. So it seems to me.
If I might, real quick.
Mr. Constant.
Thank you, and I can see the election stuff getting very uncomfortable as we're discussing politics around an elections ordinance. And so I will say for the record that I recognize this isn't a concern for the election staff, but it is a concern for us as policymakers. And so I just want to recognize that that is a condition, that this isn't an elections conversation per se, it's a policy conversation.
Well, in this committee, sometimes there's lines that are crossed that maybe aren't crossed in other committees. Ms. Jones.
Through the chair, I will say that I appreciate the change in 7.02b. I think that there has been, there's a committee a long time ago that was working on a charter amendment that was called 90-90-90, and we just never went forward with it. But I think that the Assembly knows that the clerk's office can do an election in 60 days, and we have done that before, but I can tell you that you have usually, those vacancies were anticipated, so we were able to prepare ahead of time. But the reality is 90 days really does, as a practical matter, make more sense. And now, with the issues of paper shortages, it is even more imperative that the Assembly look. So this is the 90 days from a practical standpoint, and so, and I don't think that that's political, Mr. Constant, but we do appreciate the 90 days. Thank you very much.
Well, and you know, there's a lot of moving parts in putting an election together, as you're well aware, and the timing all has to mesh together, or if once part of the election gets behind, then you got a major problem. And we're dealing with vendors in the lower 48. They're doing printing, I believe, and so that can create an additional challenge. So yeah, I understand. Okay, Mr. Weddleton, Mr. Cross, any additional comments? Presentation with the presentation today?
I don't. John, did you have anything else that you were thinking? You had a note that you had wanted to add, or that you were considering.
Yeah,
Proceed.
this actually, I think, comes from, Chris, is your, when you did the ordinance and the phrasing. So on this, page 2, 3, line 17, it shall take office 30 days after certification, add or as close as practicable. Maybe use a different word, but maybe if that landed on, 4th of July or something, maybe pick another day or something. But I think that was in, when you wrote the kind of your thing, your version of this in the ordinance. Is that something that would be important?
Mr. Crossy?
Thanks. So I didn't bring up my ordinance really, but I definitely need to resurrect it to review it. So I can't give a square answer as to the intent and purpose of that language off the top of my head. But I will look.
Well, so are you, do you think that you could get together with Mr. Cross and work out differences, or now in our next meeting?
So, like I said, I didn't dredge it up, and I'm still weighing my concerns on the question of whether that's another way to go or not. Again, the sweetener of ensuring that we don't have to take a major hit to the Assembly's budget, the tax cap piece, it's dragging me along in a way that I just really wasn't before. And so I don't know that I'll be moving that or consider it, but I'll share it and we can talk about it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And we do have a work session on October 7th, so I think it's a week and a half to digest that.
So, Mr. Gates, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up and sharing with Mr. Cross and myself.
The draft ordinance that you have. Do you mean right this minute?
No.
Or sure, absolutely.
I'm going to be gone from the 1st to the 5th, so I won't be spending practical time on this because I'll be doing more fun things. But before then and after, yes.
All right, thanks.
Mr. France?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment on the tax increase limitation section. I appreciate you including that in there. We had a good conversation. I think it was in a Rules Committee meeting a year or so ago. Some people actually suggested that perhaps the costs ought to be attributed directly to districts, like that resulted from like recall elections. And so that was a pretty robust conversation. But that's something I have been in favor of and appreciate that being in there. A longstanding amendment that I have and had prepared for when this was to come before the body earlier was a fairly simple one concerning backfilling an assembly member who is serving as acting mayor, because it is a pretty easy, it's pretty easy for the assembly to appoint someone in a temporary seat. I don't think it's that costly. I mean, in terms of the time, if there's a notice that's put out, we did a kind of interview, question, answer sort of session. Ranked choice, that's right. We had ranked choice. Sorry, Austin, I keep moving away from the microphone. But anyway, I do think it would be helpful to be able to temporarily backfill. And again, that was possible, but Austin was serving because it wasn't, per the definition, it's not considered a vacancy. Right, so we weren't able to do that. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. France. Any comments, questions after Mr. France's comment?
No, I just really appreciate their contribution. I value their insights, so thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cross. Any additional comments about 2022-77 before we got about 3 or 4 minutes here before we're supposed to adjourn today? Comments from the clerk's office, additional?
No additional comments?
Okay, great. Well, then I guess we'll go down the agenda. I don't believe we have additional unfinished business today, so let's go to audience participation. Is there anyone that would like to participate that is in the audience or maybe calling in on the phone? If you're on the phone, it's *6 to unmute. Anyone? Going once, going twice? Not seeing anyone. I'll take a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
We are adjourned. Thank you.